Tom Campbell here. If you find something of significant value in our videos, please consider supporting their production through our Patreon account or through a one-time donation. The links are in the description below. Thank you and enjoy the video.
Well, good afternoon, Tom. Thank you for being here. We left a couple of MBT Forum questions out of our last Fireside chat, and since we want to stay caught up on those questions for everyone, we're going to go ahead and put out a short addendum to the Fireside chat again. These questions are from August, so we are keeping ahead of the game. Question from the MBT Forum on body leads and mind follows. Now, you often say the other way around, the mind leads and the body follows. But this question is, I often wonder how much body leads and mind follows. If you have a broken leg, obviously you need to stick by the rule set and follow what the body can do. But when it comes to anxiety or some other neurological problem that might be inherited in your family culture or gene pool, how much is the mind leading? I understand there would be more probability in changing the condition with intent, as it is unseen problem at some stage, but could these types of conditions be more likely hardwired and follow the biology rather than consciousness quality? Or is it a result of the outside changing the inside? The way tech has exploded and the brain senses overworked, I can see it as a mind-changing brain matter thing, as we are yet to evolve physically to deal with this. Can you comment on that?
You know, we don't have the body modifying consciousness, not directly. What we have is there's an interplay between the avatar and the consciousness. So, and the rule set. Let's put those three things in there together. We have the avatar, which is basically just an embodiment of the rule set. It has evolved according to the rule set. So the avatar just represents the rule set. It's what the rule set has evolved to be in this particular species, and everything has to be done according to the rule set. So yes, if you break an arm, as they say, now the consciousness has to deal with an avatar with a broken arm. So it has a different decision space. Certain things it can do now that it maybe, or is doing now that maybe it didn't do before. Like, you know, do everything with one hand. It didn't do that before, and now it's doing it before. And it's not doing things that it could do before because before it had two arms. So what the consciousness can do with the avatar is constrained by the rule set. Again, the avatar being the culmination of the rule set in that particular evolved species called, you know, Homo sapiens. So there is this interplay between the two. But besides that, the consciousness can modify the avatar to some degree. Now, not to any degree, but just to some degree. And again, it has to be, its modifications have to be within the uncertainty that's natural to the avatar and the rule set. So the rule set has enough uncertainty in it, then the consciousness can do some modification of that avatar. That's the, you know, that's the mind leads, body follows. On the other hand, the body doesn't ever lead the consciousness, it just constrains the consciousness. So it can add on new constraints or it can take away old constraints. Okay, so that's, you know, you eat some psychedelic drug, and you've reduced some constraints to certain sorts of experiences. So what the physical body does or doesn't do is always tied to the rule set, and it can lower constraints and it can raise constraints based on the physical things that that physical body is doing. In other words, according to the rule set, according to the choices that the consciousness makes. So the consciousness and the avatar, the consciousness and the rule set, are in an interactive game with each other. So each one, in a way, affects what the other one can do. But it's only the consciousness that can change the body in a direct way. Now, the avatar changes the consciousness in only one way, and that is that and it's indirect, not direct. It allows the consciousness to grow up. The consciousness will change based on it making choices for that avatar. But that's really the consciousness changing the consciousness. That's why I say it's an indirect. So the body is not actually, the cause of the change in consciousness. It's just an indirect player in that game. So because of the rule set, the avatar has lots of complex and meaningful choices, and the consciousness plays those choices and grows up. So you might say that the avatar is helping the consciousness grow up, but really the consciousness is growing itself up, and the avatar is a tool that the consciousness is using in order to grow itself up. So that's the way it works. The idea that our physical system is changing, is still evolving. Well, of course it is. Evolution isn't done. It's not like human beings are done. So because we are going to have to deal with a lot more information, we're going to have ways of dealing with that more quickly. Yes, our central nervous system and other things are probably going to change. Our bodies may change too. I saw one projection, this was a long time ago, but they were projecting what the human might look like, like in 100 years or maybe 200 years. And it had a real spindly little body because the body evidently was going to be augmented with, kind of an exoskeleton on the outside that would make it strong and make it fast and make it do all those things. But the actual body itself was going to be weak and puny with a great big head, because to be smarter was going to be important. So they had the future human looking like a little weakling with a huge head, because the machines were going to do all the work for that human. So the human didn't need to have many muscles, and he'd put on his exoskeleton suit to go out in the world and do heavy lifting, because he'd have this suit on that would actually do all the heavy lifting for him. So it was just manipulating the controls on the inside. So that was their view. Now, whether that's a good, an accurate view or not, I don't know. I kind of doubt it. But yes, we're going to change. So that's just evolution. So yes, our avatars are constantly changing to meet the pressures that this virtual reality, puts on them. They are products of the virtual reality. Our avatar is a product of the virtual reality, product of the rule set. So no doubt that changes, and no doubt as that changes, it will allow that human to create different sorts of situations for which the conscious will now make choices. So the whole choice set will change as that human evolves, because it will allow the consciousness to do more things or do less things. If everybody has a spindly little body, then they're not going to be doing a whole lot of sports unless they do it in these big exoskeleton suits, you see, and then you kind of lose the point of it. Now it's whoever has the best technology wins, rather than whoever is the most fit and has the most skill wins. Well, skill might still be important. So that's basically how that works out, that we have evolution in a virtual reality, and that is always run by the rule set. The consciousness can't do things with the avatar that disobey the rule set, for the most part. There's always ways to hack the system, to cheat a little bit around the edges. That's the psi uncertainty principle. Psi uncertainty principle says that you can use your intent, that's consciousness, intent, to modify future probability of what happens in the virtual reality, in the physical world. So that way, consciousness is modifying the physical world. It only works that one way. The physical world doesn't modify the consciousness world. The conscious world modifies the physical world. So that's why I say it's consciousness leads, and the body, all of physical reality basically, follows. So that's the reason for that. But yes, the physical body is still evolving, still changing. And the game is a dynamic game. That's why you're not going to run out of choices, because the set of choices keeps changing, keeps growing, getting bigger and bigger. Just think of the things that we can do today that we didn't do 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Look at all the choices we have that people didn't have then. If you go back 200 or 300 years, most people never got much further than about 20 miles away from where they were born. Well, people now go to work 20 miles further away from where they live. They make that commute every day. So it's, everything changes. The decision space is constantly in flux. So there's always new things to learn. So evolution is an open-ended process that doesn't have an endpoint. It just keeps on changing. And as one thing changes, that influences other things to change, and other things change, and other things change. And so the whole system is rife with constant change, constant growth, conscious, or I should say, constantly redefining and re-engineering itself. That's the nature of evolution. And consciousness is evolving and doing the same thing.
All right, thank you for that. The next question is actually on subjectivity versus objectivity. After a life packet in PMR and having gone through the transition reality and a possible life review, can I stay in NPMR for as long as I want to?
Simple question, simple answer. Yes, you can. There's nothing at any time in your process of being that is going to force you to do something that you don't want to do. So if you get to that point and you say, nah, I'm going to sit out for a while, or no, I don't like that incarnation, I don't want to do that, then you won't. You have free will, and your choices are not overridden by anybody else or anything else. The system will not override your choices either. So sure, you can always say no. At any point, at any time, you can, basically make the choices that are available to you. And often one of those choices is no.
All right. The next question on the list is, would my PMR identity and memory remain intact until my life review is complete?
No. Actually, your PMR memory doesn't remain intact for very long, only minutes, not for very long, right after you die. That memory of that life starts to dissipate and disappear like a dream. So as time goes on, all of that becomes forgotten. It's more dreamlike. Now you can go and look at the records, and you can maybe sort through the databases, perhaps, if you're aware enough to do that. But for the most part, no, you don't have that memory anymore. Now you have the viewpoint of not the free will awareness unit, which was the thing that had all the experiences with your last avatar, but now you have the viewpoint soon after death of the individuated unit of consciousness. You see, not the free will awareness unit. The free will awareness unit was actually the piece of consciousness that was your consciousness while you were, logged on to an avatar. That was the avatar's consciousness. And it belongs to an individuated unit of consciousness. And now you have that perspective after you die, after you transition Shortly after you die, you have the attitude of the IUOC, and that's a different attitude. And you do not have the memory, although all of those things are there in the database. And in your life review, when you sit there, questions will be asked and issues will be brought up, and you'll get little vignettes out of that life you just had, to kind of show you from a third-party perspective, because now you're not in it. You're both in it, you're the character playing it, and you're outside of it looking at it objectively. And you get to see it from both perspectives. And that's helpful in you making realizations of what your motivations were, and why did you act that way, and why did you say those things. All that becomes perfectly clear. While when you were making those, doing those things, it wasn't clear at all why you were doing that way. You were doing, why you were doing things that way. You were being pushed by your fears, pulled by your beliefs, serving your ego, and none of that you were doing any of that was not clear. You thought you were just being logical and rational and doing the thing that needed to be done, when in fact you were being pushed and pulled by fears and egos and beliefs. And that's what the life review is to kind of let you see that from a more objective perspective than you had when you were in it. So at that point, you do remember all those things. You see it, and then you remember perfectly being in it. So then you are in it. But then when you move on to the next vignette, well, you remember that too. And you remember being in it, and you can replay it. But then when that life review is over, it's still like a dream. This life review like brings out this dream, aspects of this dream you had, to a clear thing. But without the life review, that's just a fuzzy dream.
The list goes on to say, if my memory, PMR Life, fades like a dream when my awareness is no longer in PMR, but now in NPMR, how would I remember all PMR Life events during my life review in NPMR? Will you just kind of explain that?
Just explain that, yeah. You don't really remember it in a sense. It's that you're being guided through it. So it's like somebody else is the master of ceremony. Somebody else is in charge, and they're showing you things. And you say, oh, well, I wasn't like this. I wasn't like that. I was nearly perfect. I was helpful. I was kind to everyone. And they say, oh, really? Well, what about this? And then they show you kicking your dog, and swearing at your children and doing these things that you weren't really all peace and calm like you thought. And you'll say, yeah, that was just because, such and such made me angry. And then they'll show you something else that will show you that the such and such really didn't make you angry. You were angry because you had all this fear and this belief and whatever. And the whole point of it is to get is for you to grow up. But as it shows it to you, you get put into it, if you will, almost like you were in the database. Okay, think of it this way. When you go to this life review, the life review has the database. It's all, it has the whole database right there spooled up on a hard drive someplace. Everything you did, said, thought, felt. And as you say things, it's got this knowledge about where everything is on this database. So it pulls up all the pertinent spots and it shows them to you. And when it shows them to you, you remember it, you feel it, you're in it, and you're doing it. Okay. And then it shows you something else and you're in that and feeling that and doing it. But it's not like you're pulling this out of your memory. The memory's gone. But if you don't have a life review, if you just go to the databases themselves, you can do a similar thing. You can go into that database, go to something that happened, 3 decades ago. And when you step into that, there you are. You're in it 3 decades ago. Except you also can see it from an objective viewpoint outside. You can play it and see it from an objective viewpoint both ways. And you can do that if you want to go not just a couple of decades back, but 4 or 5 lifetimes back. You can get into it, you can play it, and when you get into it, you're there. You're living it. You have all the data that gives you all the memories associated with that particular time. So think of it as just data out of the database being used in a particularly clever way to give you access to the past, to give you access to the feelings. Remember, all the data's in the database. It's not just the pictures. It's not like somebody just took a movie. It's the feelings, the attitudes, the thoughts, things expressed, things not expressed. It's you and all the things that you were as the consciousness and the choices you had. So when you get into that database, you're you again at that spot with that data. You see? So you're thinking that that's really you in your old memory. It's not you in your old memory. It's you and your old data, if you will. And you're pulling up all of it, attitudes, thoughts, feelings, everything, all the detail. And that's not coming from memory, that's coming from the database. So this life review is a database review, is what's going on. That's where the information comes from.
You're speaking of this from a lot of experience. And at this particular point, we're speaking of this in the terms of a life review in NPMR, which is non-physical matter reality. However, this can be done from your consciousness in PMR as well, would you say?
Well, your consciousness is never in PMR, but it can be done while your avatar.
This is what I mean.
Right. I know what you meant. I just wanted to make sure the words were right.
Yes.
You can do this while your avatar's alive and well in its virtual reality, PMR. Yes. So you can have a similar experience. You can do your own life review. And it's not only your life, but your life before that and before that. And actually you can get into characters' viewpoints that isn't your life. You're not just limited to your own life. You can get into other people's experiences too. The data is available for all. But when you're playing yourself, everything naturally kind of makes sense to you. When you're playing somebody else, it doesn't feel so natural. It's more, your intellect has to get more involved. It's not such a good fit. So it's a little different when you're playing somebody else. But yes, you can get into this while your avatar is alive and well, and you can look at your life, like I say, a decade or two ago, or 2 or 3 lifetimes ago. And it's pretty much the same thing. You can be objective, looking at it like a voyeur, looking at the movie, feeling the feelings and whatever, or you can actually get into it and start interacting. But it's just you interacting with the database, and the life review is the same way.
All right, the list goes on with, while in NPMR, what shape would I have? Do I wear clothes? Do I have all my senses? Smell, taste, hear, see? How is that?
No, you don't have any of that, really. You imagine that you have whatever parts of it you need. If you think you need to look at something, like in your life review, you're seeing things, you're hearing things, you're smelling things, you're there, well, then you have all that data that you interpret as all those things. But it doesn't mean that you are a being, with a nose and ears and eyes. It's just information. Your consciousness. With consciousness, you have no form. You have no space. Your consciousness. Consciousness doesn't take up space. Space is created by making a point, calling it an origin, then defining 3 orthogonal unit vectors, x, y, and z, and suddenly you've defined space everywhere. That's Cartesian space. That's the space that we think we live in, and that's where most of our time in the VR, takes place, in that kind of a space. That's our experience. That's our experience space. So consciousness doesn't have space, but consciousness creates space as an equation, so that it makes a 3D virtual reality to play things out. So no, when you are experiencing these things, you're getting data from a data stream, and you are experiencing smell, taste, hearing, sight, just like you always did. That's what we are. We're consciousness. We don't have eyes and ears and noses. We get data sent to us according to the VR. See, we're playing when we're logged on. We're logged on to an avatar that does have eyes and ears and a nose and taste buds and skin. So because our avatar has that, and the avatar only has that because that's what the rule set says the avatar has. There really is no avatar. It's a virtual reality. The avatar is just a computation, doesn't really exist. The rule set says that this virtual avatar would have eyes, ears, nose, and, taste, skin for touch. But you really are just getting data from a database that you interpret that way. You're interpreting it as seeing, feeling, whatever. That's the data that you get, that's your interpretation. So when you are in NPMR, where you don't have an avatar, the system can send you data and you can interpret it as hearing, seeing, smelling, whatever, because you've been there. You've learned how to interpret that data. And that's what it's about. So no, you don't need eyes, nose, ears, and stuff to hear, see, smell. You never did. All you ever did was interpret data. And you learned how to interpret that data as an infant. Okay, you log on to this embryo, or you log on to this fetus, whatever it is, and then it gets born and you start hearing, seeing, feeling, tasting things. Well, you did in utero. You did see, just everything was kind of cloudy. You didn't see real clearly. You could hear things. It started in utero. After you're born, then you start learning how to define these things, what it means. Okay, and that's how you learn how to interpret that data. From then on, you get sent this data. That's what you experience. So experience is you interpreting data. It's not you smelling something. It's you interpreting data as a smell, as a particular smell, you see. So there really isn't a problem with not having eyes and ears and nose while you're in non-physical. You never had an eyes, ears, or nose, never. Eyes, ears, and nose don't exist. They're just virtual avatars, virtual eyes, virtual nose, virtual smells. In a virtual reality, all those smells and all those things are there because the rule set says that they need to be there. They're all products of evolution and the rule set. That's where they come from.
All right, thank you. Speaking of the rule set, does food and drink have nutritional value or just a social aspect? And I'm assuming that he's coming from a consciousness aspect rather than the physical rule set.
Yeah, well, it has both. There's social value in eating and drinking, and to appreciate it, all you have to do is go on a fast. If you go on a fast where you stop eating for 1 or 2 weeks, enough to be long enough that you can assess the social impact, where if you just are on a fast for a day or 2 days, well, there's really hardly any social impact because it's so small. But if you're fasting for at least a week, and more likely 2 or 3 weeks, then the social consequences are pretty obvious. So there is a social thing to it, but there's also the rule set. The rule set has evolved in this virtual reality. It's evolved our virtual body, and our virtual body has inputs and outputs. It takes in food to create energy and to support all the things we do. It excretes some, gives off heat, it has all of these properties. And that's part of the rule set. So now, can that be, can you hack the system there and get around that? Well, there are people, they call them breatharians, who don't eat and don't drink and seem to be able to do just fine for very long periods of time. Well, that violates the rule set. Rule set says that's impossible. Well, the impossible happens sometimes under the right conditions. According to the psi uncertainty principle, it takes place. And everybody who's not ready to deal with that ignores it because they figure, oh, that's just a bunch of BS. Of course, that doesn't happen. It couldn't possibly happen because it's impossible. So it doesn't happen. Therefore, it's all a scam. It's all somebody making stuff up and a bunch of silly people believing it and so on. So it flies under the radar. That allows it to be possible. So all kinds of things can break the rules under special conditions for sometimes special people who are doing things to help wake the rest of us up. And the system will support that, can support that. Now, does that mean that somebody claims they're a breatharian and haven't eaten for 300 years? Does that mean that that's a fact? No, somebody could just be making that up. It could be a lie. It could be a story. But does it mean that it must be false? No, doesn't mean that either. Almost anything can happen in a virtual reality. That's why you have to always be very skeptical. You have to always be very skeptical of everything. There's very little certainty in this existence.
Well, thank you. Now, we don't recommend you do this at home. So
no.
Do eat and drink. The next question on the list is, if I seek my dead friends and relatives, would I find them?
Probably. Depends mostly on why you seek them. Let's say you seek them because you're really angry with them, and what you want to do is give them a piece of your mind. You'd like to tell them, how useless they were, and how they didn't help you, and how, your interaction with them was what led you to get run over by that truck. Now you've just passed on, and you've just got here, and what you want to do is look up those relatives and give them and tell them how they screwed everything up. Well, in that case, you probably will not find them. So it depends more on why you want to see them and what value that seeing them would have to you. If you want to see them just because you want to know if you could see them, hey, can I see my relatives here? Let's line them all up. I'd like to say hello. Yeah, the last 3 lifetimes, line them all up. I'd like to say hello. Well, you probably won't see them then either, because the system isn't necessarily going to support that. It's not really going to be that educational for you. You're just playing. But if there's some point, some connection, some resolution, something that's significant to your growth that needs to happen, that needs to make that connection, well, then you'll probably see them. You see, because anything that's on your path to growing up will be made possible. That's what the system does. So then you would see them. So it depends a lot on why you want to see them, what the point is. Does it come out of your ego? Does it come out of your belief? Where is it coming from? If it's a fear-based thing like ego and belief, then no, the system isn't going to indulge your fear-based stuff. If it's something that's actually helpful to you to grow up, some connection, something maybe a loved one and you didn't feel like it ended well, like you died before you actually got to apologize, something was going on and you feel this kind of stuck in you and you really feel a need to make closure on that. Well, then that will probably be facilitated and you will get to do that. So you see, that depends. So it depends on the situation. It's not, we tend to think of the non-physical reality as just like the physical reality. It's not. It's a different kind of a situation. I mean, people think, well, when I get there, I can either see them or I can't. If they're available, then I can see them. Well, not necessarily so. Depends on your intent, depends on where you're coming from. It's not just like this reality. In this reality, they're either available or they're not. You can either go see them or it's impossible. It's easy. It's one or a zero. Simple. There, it's not so much like that. Now you're in intuitive space. Mental space tends to be intuitive space, and intuitive space has a lot of other variables in it besides, facts are not as important in intuitive space as relationships, as connections, as the reason why. That has a little more significance. So it's a different kind of reality frame that works differently, has different dynamics. So you may be able to see them, you may not. But if you need to see them, yes, you will. If you don't really need to see them, but you just want to do it for fun, maybe you'll get it, maybe you won't. Kind of depends how the system assesses it.
All right, thank you, Tom. And I know that you recommend that you reach a point consciousness, you have an intent for a specific person with this dead friend or relative. And if you focus clearly on that, that could be a possibility for you then.
Sure.
Right.
People who make those kinds of connections when they're alive, like a medium can connect with people who've passed on, and the medium is an avatar here. So that's just a consciousness, making that connection, using the medium as a medium to talk through. So that is that. But now once that medium dies and is no longer here, can that medium still make connections? Well, probably so. If that medium retains that level of understanding, will that medium make connections? Probably not, because at that point, there really isn't a lot of point in it. It's got other things to do at that point. So.
Okay. I'll go on with the next question on the list. And you've really answered this one. It goes on. Robert Monroe's out-of-body experiences, are they subjective experiences between Robert and the LCS in a point-to-point virtual space? And I think you've probably made that.
Yeah, for the most part, yes. Most of the time, they were there for him to learn things. And he did learn things in given situations and connections. And, they were there for Bob's education for the most part. Bob was a very inquisitive guy, so he always had questions in his mind someplace about, I wonder how this works. I wonder how that works. What's the mechanism there? That's just the way Bob was. So because he had these questions, he got those answers. They were his answers, and he got them, and then he got them as data, and then he had to unpack that data through his own understanding, his own beliefs, his own fears, his own knowledge, his own experience, just like everybody else has to unpack it. So that means that his interpretation carries his own personal stuff with it. His interpretation has a component to him that isn't just factual. This is what was there, but this is the closest approximation I can make to what I saw. Well, what you see is how you interpret the data. You see, so in the non-physical, you get a lot of metaphors. A lot of things are metaphorical. And if you take everything as literally, it's literal, then you have a lot of things that don't seem to make sense, because literally they often don't make sense. Same with dreams. A lot of dreams don't make sense until you realize what all the metaphors are, what the symbolism is, and then suddenly, oh, that's very meaningful. But if you take it literally, it just was a bunch of stuff that didn't seem to make any sense. Well, a lot of out-of-bodies are like that too. So people go out and they come back and they report what they see, smell, taste, touch, how they feel. They report it very literally for the most part. You have to read between the lines and see what the metaphors were, what really was going on there, not just read it as a literal experience. That's true even here. When your avatar goes out and interacts with people, comes back and tells you about it, what you're getting is their interpretation of it. Not necessarily exactly what happened and why it happened, but their interpretation of it is what you're getting. So it's the same here. You have to not always take everything literally. You have to kind of read between the lines and see the bigger picture of what was going on. So yes, the answer to that is Bob was mostly in a single player game, because most of the things he did, it wasn't him and a group of people off, exploring together. It was him. That's basically the way single player games work. It was him. And Did it have to be a single player game? No, it's just, that's the simplest explanation to describe out of body. Could he have had an out of body that had other IUOCs in it that were, not NPCs? Of course, he could. How can we tell the difference? We can't. So you get from it what you get from it. It's most likely to be a single player game. That doesn't mean that it couldn't be anything else.
You and Dennis did meet up.
We did meet up. And it was obviously, that was a multiplayer game and it had 2 players in it. It was Dennis and I.
Definitely Dennis and you, as you had that recorded.
Right. And it was recorded, and he saw things, and I saw the things he saw, and he saw the things I saw, and we described them to each other. And there was enough back and forth interplay that there was obviously the 2 of us there.
That you can verify.
Now, were we the only 2 there? Was everything else NPCs? Maybe, maybe not. The point is, it doesn't matter. You see, that distinction of are they NPCs or not is a false distinction. It isn't important. It's the wrong thing to hang value on. We make so much value. Well, if it's NPC, that's one thing. And if it's another player, it's totally different. It shouldn't be different. It should be all the same thing as far as how you act and interact. That's like saying, well, if they're rich people, well, that's one thing. That's important. But if they're poor people, they're not important. We can just ride right over them. Well, if it's NPCs, they're not important. We can just ride right over them. But if it isn't, if it's players, then we should be nice. You see that? How we bifurcate ourselves into the person who's nice and loving and the person who really doesn't give a damn and rides over top of people. Well, we shouldn't be like that. We shouldn't be, with these people, we're nice, and with these people, we don't care. You should care about everybody. And it doesn't matter whether they're NPCs or not. That's not the point. You're interacting with them. Interact with caring. Interact with love. And you will grow up all the time. You see? So this differentiation between who do we have to be nice to and who can we run over means that you're not really nice. You're just acting nice. And you want to know how to act. Shall I act nice or can I act belligerent? You see, it's all about acting. Well, that means you're running out of your ego and out of your beliefs, not out of your love. That's the problem. If you are not acting, but you are love, you do care, then it doesn't make any difference. You don't have to say, well, do I have to care about these rich people or care about these poor people? It doesn't make any difference. You care about all of them. Doesn't matter whether they're rich or poor. It's irrelevant. You treat each one of them with respect. You see, each one of them with humility. You're as helpful as you can to all of them because you really are love. You're not trying to act like it. You're not coming from your intellect. So it doesn't matter about this NPC thing. It's just not the point. If you're a person of love, then you interact with all individuals that you meet with love. And trying to determine whether they're NPCs, which you could just run over because it doesn't matter, they're just NPCs, or whether they're other players, which now you need respect, or it's the system now you should suck up and bow down and be particularly on your toes. Well, that's just working out of your intellect, trying to pretend that you are something you aren't, wanting to know who do you have to be nice to and who can you kick. And that's not the way of a nice person. A nice person doesn't kick anybody, and they learn from everyone. So that's, I don't know. It's hard to get that through people's heads that the game of, what was that called? The soul retrieval game that at TMI. What was the name of it?
Lifeline?
Lifelines, yeah. That's Lifeline. So that the Lifelines game isn't really important anymore because they might be NPCs. That's somebody who's playing at being good. If you really are a person of love, then it doesn't matter. You approach all things the same way. We don't try to divide it. The people I need to be nice to and really care about, and the people I don't. It's all information. I mean, what is a people? A people is information. If it's another player, that's information. If it's an NPC, it's information. You can't tell the difference. they're all the same. So treat them all the same. Care about all of them the same way.
It's really about your learning and your evolution and your growth and the system's goal of evolving towards love. So you are helping by doing and looking at it that way, as you just said.
Yeah, it's not like we look at the poor people and say, well, what we really need to do is pretend that poor people are really rich people. No, not really. What you need to do is look at poor people and rich people and just care for all of them. It's like, well, we have to pretend that these non-player characters, these NPCs, are really characters. We have to pretend that. No, you don't have to pretend it. Approach everything in these experiences with love, because you'll never know for sure what's what, and it doesn't matter. It's the wrong thing to ask. Just connect everything that way. It's who you are. It's what you are. You can't connect anything any differently. So that's the point. If it makes a big difference, if your bubble gets deflated because they're only NPCs, you're not looking at it from the right perspective.
All right, I'll move along to the next question on the list, which is, how are other consciousness explorers able to visit the same places, such as Focus 27, and report the same information as Robert?
Oh, well, that's easy. Lots of people who read Robert's books reported all sorts of things that Robert saw, because his metaphors have become their metaphors. His understanding has become what they believe in, has become their beliefs. What you see out there is you interpret it according to your beliefs, according to your knowledge, according to all those things. So, there's lots of people, you don't have to go to 27, there's lots of people who go to Bob's Park, and they can interact in Bob's Park. And I'm sure that Dennis and I together both could have gone to Bob's Park, and we could have met there and, kind of sat on a park bench and looked at the squirrels, say, look, you see that squirrel? Yeah, I see a squirrel over there. We could have done that too. The point is that Bob's Park is just a metaphor. It's Bob's place of relaxation. And we take him literally. Yes, that's what he sees. That's how he interprets a place of relaxation. But you can't take that literally. You see, that's just his interpretation of this relaxing, wonderful place. But now once everybody else says, well, there's this park out there in the non-physical, it's called Bob's Park. And Bob described it, so I sort of know what it looks like. And sure enough, you can go there and you can find it. You can walk around in Bob's Park. You might even run into Bob himself, and he might be, feeding the pigeons, and whatever. But that's, that doesn't mean that Bob's Park is out there. It just means that you are interpreting something very similar to what you read about, because you read about it, and in your mind, you believe that that's what's there.
Is that a construct, and is that also an address? As you say, you can visit places again and again. If this is a construct, and that's a particular address, and you've been there, you could use that address as a...
It can be that, particularly if enough people do it. If you get 10,000 people and they're all going to Bob's Park, then Bob's Park becomes a kind of a thing in mental space, right? It's 10,000 people go there. So in that case, you can just have an intent to go to Bob's Park, and you'll perhaps go to something very similar, because it can become an address. Well, it can be. That's the collective consciousness. If we all read the same books, then we all use the same metaphors, then we all have, investment in the same things, the same attitudes, and seeing the same things. So we intend to then interpret our data. We interpret our data into a reality that fits the pattern that we believe is there. And as that gains usage in the collective consciousness, it gets easier and easier to do.
So if it's easier for some people to go through the focuses, that's fine, but you could also access it as an address as well.
Sure. There's nothing particularly fundamental about focus 27 or 18 or 15 or what are the other ones, 12, 10. It's not like those things actually define a specific non-physical space. They don't. They're also metaphorical. They define whatever anybody wants them to define. Bob gives some suggestions. 15, the place of no time. So he gives them that kind of a thing. And you go there to experience this place of no time. But nobody really thinks that if there is no time, there is no experience. Experience requires a flow separated in time. If there is no time, then there is no experience. So a place of no time would have no experience, but that's not what Bob meant. Bob meant you went to a place where things just are, right? They're not, in his mind, they weren't time-based. So when he said there is no time, you can't take that literally. Even that is a metaphor. People go there and have all sorts of experiences, which means there's plenty of time there. They wouldn't be having any experiences. Experiences means this happens, then that happens, then that happens, and the next thing happens. And pretty soon, if you get enough things happening in a row, you have an experience. An experience requires time. Of course, there's time. But that means something to most people, and they kind of get a sense of what is this 15 supposed to be like. And so that's what they turn it into. 12 is supposed to be where you communicate. So when you get to 12, you start doing communication things because that's what you're supposed to do there. So all of that is, you're being led into specific metaphors and constructs, and you take those on and work with them. And that's fine. There's nothing at all wrong with that. That's a perfectly good way to do things. Most people will find it easier to experience the non-physical if they're led and given metaphors and given constructs with it to work in. They don't have to do it all on their own. It makes it a simpler thing. So if you've got a meditation that's a guided meditation, then you're going to get to that space that you're guided to, and you will see it as you are guided to see it. And from there, you can go explore out and do other things that are not in your guidance. That's fine. And that is easier than if you just say, well, sit down, close your eyes, be quiet, and go explore. Oh, how do I do that? You see, the intellect jumps in, and now you're paralyzed with your intellect, and people can't do anything. But sit down and just listen. I'll guide you through this process of meditation, and we'll go off and explore. Oh, I can do that, you see. So it's a simpler process for most people because they don't have to take charge of it themselves. They kind of float along on somebody else's suggestions. But that also means they're limited in some ways. They're limited to within the metaphors and suggestions that they're given until they take charge of it themselves and go off and have their own thing, which you can go off and have your own thing from for focus 10, 12, 15, 27, 110, whatever you want to make up. The signposts themselves and the numbers are not fundamental. They don't mean anything in particular. They're just sit there as here's the signpost, and we'll give it some description to help people out. So, all the focuses are completely non-fundamental, but it doesn't mean that they're not helpful. They're good tool set. And it's a tool set that makes things easier for most people.
All right, well, I will go to the next question. Are all PMRs and NPMRs subjective realities controlled by the LCS? I think you've probably answered this one too, but...
Yes, for the most part, that is correct. Now we're just talking about it now in a bigger picture. If we raise the level of the discussion up to the top level, bigger picture, then everything is just the LCS, and we're a part of it. So when I say LCS, that's us too. We're all a part of the LCS, and yes, everything is the LCS, and period. But that by itself is not a very good explanation of anything. You see, it doesn't help anybody learn much. If you say, well, what's going on here, Tom? And I say, well, it's the LCS does it. Well, how does this work? Well, the LCS does it. And I had this experience. What does that mean? Well, the LCS gave you that, and who knows what it means. You know, if that's the same as God does it. Yes, everything is God's, and God does it. You know, why is it raining today? Well, God did it. You know, I'm having a picnic next Saturday. Can we make the sun shine? Well, I don't know. God will do it. You know, it's not that there's anything wrong with that, saying the LCS does it, God does it, or whatever. You know, it's not that that is a wrong answer. It's just not a useful answer. It's not an answer that gives anybody any help in understanding anything. So it's a useless answer for the most part. Yes, there is source. You can call source whatever you want to call source. I call it the larger conscious system. I say it's not a supernatural source. It's a natural source. It's consciousness. It's evolving. It's still evolving. It's not done. It's not perfect. It's an evolving system, and we're a piece of it. But if we run right back up to the highest level description, yes, the LCS does everything. That's not really that interesting. What's interesting is to create a structure, a logical structure, not a belief-based structure, but a logical structure on that consciousness as source, and see if you can't logically then explain everything else as a subset of the logic of source. And source has to have its own logic. What does it mean that source is evolving? Evolving how? To what? You see, and you can answer those questions. And where did it start from? Well, you can start with this little, reality cell or whatever. It's this simple little consciousness that can't do much. And then you can go through the whole process of how it would have evolved. And meanwhile, all sorts of logical consequences are falling out all along. Oh, this explains that, and that explains this other thing. So as you break it down into its logical elements, as long as those elements are logical, in other words, necessary things that have to be there for source to evolve, then these other things had to be this way, otherwise source couldn't evolve. And they are a logical necessary part of this evolution of source. Then you end up answering a whole lot of questions about the nature of reality and what's our purpose and a whole lot of other things. But that then is useful because people can look at that and see the logic in it and how does that apply to my life? How does that affect my life? Where am I on the scale? Oh, I'm an IUOC and I'm trying to evolve by becoming love, and fear is the problem, and belief and self-centeredness, ego, these are the problems, and I need to deal with this. So they start seeing themselves. And as if the logic is true, then they can apply that information and get results. So if they apply that information, they can get rid of those fears, start getting rid of them off, and suddenly they'll find that, oh, life is better. Relationships are better. I'm happier. I feel more satisfied. My life is good. I smile all the time. And before I was miserable and unhappy. Well, those are results from applying the information. But you have to give people logical information that gets down into the place where people can apply it to their everyday life. So that's the point. Just saying the LCS does it, the LCS does it, that doesn't help anybody do anything. And the system, or the logical system, has to be logical, or otherwise when you apply it, it won't work. If it's an illogical system and you apply it to your life, nothing happens. It doesn't change anything. You see, because it's not actually the way things are, because it's illogical. The system evolved. Evolution is a process. You can follow the logic in the process. So in any case, that's the point of how it works. Yes, LCS does it all, no doubt. All right, so what? Now let's work our way down into, get rid of your fear. Oh, no, that's important.
Practical applications.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, if people got rid of their fear and were still miserable, then that would be a thing that didn't fit. Then that would say that there was something wrong with the theory. But I've never actually found that. I found that people pretend to get rid of their fear. Some people, do other things. They bury their fear so deeply that they can't see it, but it's obvious, and it's not that hard to see that fear's there, when you interact with them. But if they really do get rid of that fear, then their life is better and happier, and it does work. So that's kind of the point, is to take a top level. You start at the top level, start to work out the logical consequences as defined by that top level, and then end up with a logical theory that goes all the way down into what's right and what's wrong. Well, right is the thing that lowers entropy for self and system. Wrong is things that raises entropy for self and system. You got it. Right and wrong. You see, so then that's helpful to people. If, when they apply it, it actually works and makes their life better.
All right. The list goes on to say, do each of us ultimately experience our own realities from a subjective point of view?
Yes, everything is subjective. There is no objective thing. Everything has uncertainty. Objective facts are just facts. It is that way. That is a fact. And there's nothing really that's a fact. If I say, well, okay, this brick weighs 15 pounds. That's not a fact. That's an approximation. That's a guess. I put it on the scales and it weighs 15.13652977445, and it keeps going on and on, depending on how good your measurement is. Well, if I only stop at 10 decimal places, it's still not right. That is not the fact. It goes on and on and on and on. How accurately can you measure that brick? And then you get down to the point, well, what actually is a brick? You look at the surface of the brick down at the molecular level, and it's bumpy and lumpy, and it's got warts on it, and it's not this smooth rectangular solid that we call it at all. It's all kinds of lumpy, bumpy shape, and it's all in motion. It's doing this all the time. Its little molecules are dancing and jumping around, and on a hot day, they jump around more than on a cold day, and so on. So where is the brick? Exactly how long is this brick? How much does it weigh? Oh, what minute? You mean, a brick has a vapor pressure like anything else. Molecules of that brick are flying off into, escaping from the brick itself. Other things are impacting the brick and sticking, So if you measure its weight even to 20 decimal places and then measure it again 10 minutes later, it would be different if you could measure to, say, 30 decimal places, because, a molecule just shot off. Oh, another kind of molecule just stuck. What's its weight? You see, it doesn't have a weight. It doesn't have a length. It's in motion. It's got an average weight, perhaps, and an average length, or a typical length, or typical things. But all of these things have plus or minus, ... There's always error in any measurement. So the point is, there are no facts. Even how much does this brick weigh? It's subjective. The subjective part is, well, we decide to quit after 3 decimal places. We know that's not the accurate answer of how much this brick weighs, but we're just going to assume the rest of that stuff doesn't mean anything to us, because it doesn't. That's down now in the grams or something, and we don't really care down to the nearest, half a gram as to what it weighs. That's beyond our interest. We're not interested in that. So we'll just call the brick this, but that's not what it actually weighs. You see, there is no fact about what it weighs. Its weight changes from minute to minute, day to day. So does its length change from minute to minute. Is it hot? Is it cold? What's the temperature? How much humidity is in the air? I mean, that brick's all over the place. Same with a piece of wood or anything else. You see, so we talk about the facts. Oh, this is a fact. This brick is a fact. It weighs this. That's a fact. Well, we have to look at our stuff, and it's not a fact. We say that brick weighs 20 pounds, 15 pounds, maybe 10 pounds. I don't know what bricks weigh. Probably less than that. Probably like 7 pounds, for a brick. So there's a brick and it weighs 7 pounds. That's an approximation. It's 7 plus or minus some dribble that goes off, some probability function of time, temperature, and humidity. That's the fact. So it's not precise. Nothing is precise. Everything is an approximation. The length of the brick, the color blue. Well, my color blue may not be the same as your color blue. My particular sense of that color may not at all be like yours. But I've learned that in my society, certain things I'll call blue. And you've learned that too. So we both agree, oh yeah, that curtain's blue. But your blue and my blue probably aren't the same blue.
If life and awareness is in the subjective, objectivity, including objective realities, do not exist, correct?
Yes. Yes. The only thing that is fundamental is consciousness. Everything else is a virtual reality. The idea that there is an objective reality and then a subjective reality is not true. What's true about that, there's a separation there though. And that separation is that all these things that have a very low uncertainty, we call those objective because they are sort of objective. They're objective enough. They're not really objective, but they're closer to being objective because their errors, the things that changing about them all the time, the changes are very small. So that brick doesn't go from 3 pounds to 7 pounds to 10 pounds. It goes 7 pounds plus or minus, and then stuff out in the decimal places that nobody cares about. So we call that subjective. It's an objective thing. Okay, so wherever the uncertainty of a thing is small, very small, we call it objective. And if the uncertainty of a thing is much larger, it's not objective. Okay, so that's one way that we can sort it out. So we can say this objective world, our world of physics and science is this objective world, is a world where we're dealing with stuff. And the stuff has small, relatively small uncertainties when we make measurements. Therefore, we call that the objective world. It's a world of small, and I should say relatively small uncertainties in whatever it is that we're measuring. It's the measured world with small uncertainties. All right. Then we have other things like, how do you feel today? Oh, you have a headache? How painful is that headache? Well, all of those answers to those questions would be subjective. How do I feel? Oh, I feel fine. That's subjective. I could have terrible pains, but I've dealt with them. I don't want to talk about them. So I just say I feel fine. A headache, how bad does it hurt? Very subjective. All those things are subjective because there's no way to measure them accurately. In other words, the measurement is all over the place. There's no accurate measurement at all. So, we can roughly say you have a headache. Well, we'll say on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad's your headache? Where 10 is totally, debilitating and 1 is just barely notice it. So how big's your headache? It's still subjective, even though you might say, well, it's a 7.5. But your 7.5 doesn't mean somebody else says 7.5. The two of you experiencing the same things. No way of knowing that. You see, so we can tend to make it more objective, and science does that. Psychology and sociology and medicine, all of these subjective sciences dealing with people, they try to make it as objective as they can, like with scales, from 1 to 10. So then they say, well, the average person who has a headache says they have a headache of a scale 6.5. That's the average. So then when anybody says, oh, I have a headache, they assume 6.5 because that's average. But that's not necessarily true. Not necessarily true at all. Matter of fact, that's where doctors get into most of their trouble. They assume that everybody fits the average in their statistics. 80% of the people who have this symptom will have this disease. So you have that symptom, you must have that disease. Here's the pills you go take. But you don't have that disease at all, you see, because you're in that 20% that doesn't show that symptom. So medicine makes a lot of its mistakes because it applies statistics to individuals. Statistics apply only to aggregates of individuals. Statistics don't apply to individuals, but we pretend that they do because we'll say, well, most of the time they will apply. Some of the time they don't, but we kind of forget about the some of the time and we just assume it'll apply. So we give somebody some medicine that really is not what they need at all and might hurt them and doesn't have any chance of helping them. Well, medicine does the best they can. They can't tell what's going on inside somebody. It's all subjective. So in consciousness, we sort this objective, subjective thing into two areas. We have our intellect and we have our intuitive side and our intellectual side. Left brain, right brain, if you want to put it that way. Logical and intuition. So one side tends to deal more with, it's more fact-based, more analysis-based, judgment, assessments, that kind of thing. The other doesn't use those ideas. Logic isn't a part of the intuitive. Intuitive is not a logical process. It's beyond logic. Well, beyond sounds like that's better than. I'm not saying better than. It's just, what would be a better word? Logic. It's, I'll just use beyond. It's not logical at all. It's intuitive. And that's another way that our consciousness works. It works intuitively and it works logically. On the intuitive side, you have all the information and a really ratty process. On the intellectual side, you have a really tight process of logic, but never have enough information. Both together, you have a whole human being with a really large decision space. Either one of those by themselves, and you got a lopsided human being that is only living half a life, but they could be living a whole one. So what's this objective is, our objective world is approximately objective. There is no objective world. Yes, that's true. There is no objective world. Sooner or later, you come to a statistics, you come to probability. Probability doesn't really belong in an objective world. Everything just is. The only probability is a measure of your ignorance. In the real world, there's lots of things that are uncertain. And we pretend that it's objective if the uncertainty is small. We can measure it with small uncertainty. So that's really the difference between them. So the world is really, or reality is really kind of one thing. And that piece of it that has small uncertainties, we call that the objective part. But it's really just a part of a bigger thing, you see. And that part that isn't measurable. It's not easily to measure. It's got all sorts of uncertainty tied to it because you can't measure it very well, like the amount of pain that somebody's feeling in a headache. Then all of that is subjective. But it's all the same thing because that objective part is really subjective too, in the point that where do you stop counting the decimal places is subjective. In other words, that's not the real answer. It's just good enough. Well, one person's good enough is different from somebody else's good enough. It depends on what you're doing with it, what the use is. So, you might need to measure that brick to 16 decimal places if you were using it as, something as a measurement. We're going to make up a weight. And we're going to call it one brick, and we need to know what it is very accurately. But if you're just putting it in a wall in a house, it doesn't matter too much. So how much does that brick weigh? We really don't know, but this is good enough. Yeah, it's good enough. So the subjective part is the whole. Everything's subjective. But Some stuff is highly uncertain, other stuff is not. Now, you might look at the universe and say, well, okay, we look at the universe and we'll see that there's a cloud out there and we don't know what it is. So we guess at it. We say, oh, that's a cloud of interstellar dust. And you say, well, what's interstellar dust? And people will tell you a few things. Well, it's hydrogen and it's helium and it's this and it's that. And say, well, is that all? Is there anything else in it? Well, yeah, there could be other stuff. And what are all the things that are in it? And they'll go, well, we don't know. We just see that cloud out there and we call it interstellar dust. We really don't know what it is. That's our best guess. We're making it up. That's subjective, you see. But we say, that's science. Science says it's interstellar dust. Boom. Fact. Look, interstellar dust. What's interstellar dust? I don't know. It's a lot of stuff. Comes and goes. It's the wrong question to ask. It's that sort of thing. So even the stuff that sounds very objective is subjective in the sense that, all right, this is a definition of stellar dust that's good enough. You see, it's not necessarily all the stuff that makes it up or that, and our understanding isn't that complete, and we really don't have, but so much ways of sensing it. There may be all sorts of things we don't know about it, and all of that's in the uncertainty, and all of that is subjective. It's what people think about it. It's opinion. Well, a lot of science is actually opinion. It's just the way we think that things probably are from the little bit of measurements that we've got. We're making lots of assumptions about things. And there's a lot that we don't know, and even more that we don't know that we don't know. So there's a whole lot of uncertainty, even in science. You see, we make theories, we make assumptions, we go on the little data we have, we make stuff up, and if it sounds logical, then we tend to believe it's a fact. That's a problem with science. If we kept in mind that this is not a fact, this is just an opinion or it's a model, not a fact, our science would probably be, 20 or 30 or 50 years ahead of itself right now, but we get held back like the electron. What's an electron? A little chunk of mass with a charge. Is it really? Not really. It's a probability distribution. That's impossible. It's objective. Probability distributions are not objective. Can't be a probability distribution. Well, it is. A probability distribution is what it is. We have no idea what an electron is. It's not a little chunk of matter with a charge. We thought that 60 years ago. We've come to realize that's wrong. It's not like that at all. If that's what you think it is, you get all the wrong answers when you try to, compute what's going to happen when you slam things together in over at CERN. You always get the wrong answer because that's not really what it is. It's probability distribution. Well, how come our world is made out of probability distributions? I don't understand. How could that be? This whole solid physical world is made out of probability distributions because all those little particles that make up the bigger particles, they're all probability distributions. None of them really exist as little chunks of mass. And, well, an electron sounds like a thing. Number of electrons that go by a certain place during a certain time, that defines a current. And currents have certain properties, and we make electric motors, and we're doing this broadcast now. You and I are sitting in two different places in the world, and we're talking to each other, and we have our pictures on the screen, and all that has to do with these little electrons that don't actually exist except probability distributions. You see, how is all that possible? Well, that's because we measured something that we called an electron. We named it because we were able to measure it had this smallest unit of charge. We couldn't break it apart anymore. It was the smallest unit, so we called it a thing. And it had a mass. We could measure the mass and we could measure the charge. So we said, aha, it must be a particle. It's a chunk of mass with a charge. Well, that seemed reasonable at the time, but that was just a model. What we measured wasn't a piece of mass with a charge. What we measured was the effects of a unit charge, the effects of mass, in other words, inertia of some sort. So those are the things we measured. And because we saw the effects of mass and the effects of charge, we said it must be a mass with charge. But those effects of things and a thing itself are two different things. The electron doesn't actually exist. It's a model to explain what we measured, which was the effects of charge and the effects of mass. Effects are just calculations. This is a virtual reality. They're just calculated. There are no electrons. There is no physical anything. So, there is no objective. There's nothing to be objective in this objective reality. It's all just calculations. Calculations always come with where we decide good enough's good enough, which is the rounding errors, and we don't calculate any more than that. Virtual realities only go down to the pixel level, and after that, there's nothing defined. Our reality is like that too. We have a delta X and a delta T that define space and time, and after that, smaller scale than that's not defined. Doesn't exist. You go from one unit to the next. You can't skip or go in between them. You see, so all of our science is basically based on models of measured models that describe our best guess. That's what's causing a measured effect. All we ever measure are effects. We don't ever measure electrons and protons and nuclei and those sorts of things. Don't get measured directly. Their effects get measured. Oh, look how we put this in a magnetic field and this particle goes like this and it turns in a circle. Well, all right. It must have a magnetic pole, or put it between two magnets, and that magnetic, we can calculate the force, therefore we can calculate the magnetic force, then we can calculate the mass, because that mass is being curved with a central force, making it go in the curve. And I can tell you just exactly what that mass is. But we're measuring effects of mass, not mass. And then we're ascribing it to a mass, but then we find out that that doesn't work right. It isn't really a mass. It's just something that looks like a mass. Well, that's the way a virtual reality is. A virtual reality doesn't make real things. We don't have little chunks of mass, and charge running around in a virtual reality. A virtual reality is computation. It computes a point with the attributes of mass and the attributes of charge, and that's an electron. It's a computation. And if we put that into our equations, we can calculate the right answer of what happens when we smush atoms together. So that must be the truth. But that truth is very unpopular because it says that this is a virtual reality, that this is not a material reality. There are no electrons. There's only points with attributes of mass and attributes of not mass, and these points don't even exist as points, they exist as probabilities. See, so we live in a reality that is virtual, it's probabilistic, and we've known that for about 100 years, but because nobody knows what to do with it, how to take it to the next step, then it just stalled right there. But now, once we understand virtual reality, and once we see that this is really a continuum, there is no objective on this side, subjective over here on that side, it's all really part of the same thing. It's only degrees of uncertainty separate the two. Then we can come to the conclusion that the only thing fundamental is consciousness. Consciousness is the computer, and this is a virtual reality. And then hundreds of little paradoxes drop out with logical solutions. So that's the thing about objective and subjective. It's an opinion. It's good enough, almost objective, but not really. But then we make the mistake of believing that it is. We make up models of electrons. It's just a model to explain the data that was measured, but then we make the mistake of believing in electrons, of little chunks of mass flying around. Oh yeah, a nucleus, it's like a basketball in the center and a BB going around it, you know. Of course, that's not true. It's not like that at all. That doesn't work. So science is made up of all of these things that are just models to explain measurements of effects of things. And everything is built then on that. And if you look at the basics of physics, you'll find that all the things that are fundamental to physics, by that I mean everything that physics used to calculate other things, the stuff at the bottom of the pile that is used to compute everything else, there's things like time, space, spin, mass, charge. I don't know, I probably left some of them out, but anyway, basic things. And everything else is just how these things affect each other and how these things change when they change values and move and do different things, how they interact with each other. None of those things have any source. Where does time come from? Where does mass come from? Where does charge come from? If you ask that to a physicist, they won't give you any answer. We don't know. It's just, we just assume it is because it is. It's there because we measure it. So it's there. Where does it come from? Have no idea. So all of those are also, we just model, we bring them into existence by believing in them, by believing in electrons and believing in all these things. And we name them, but they're just models, things that we make up because they explain the measurements of the effects that we get. But there's other ways to explain those measurements, like, oh, they're just computations in a virtual reality. Got them all. That explains all of them. Their explanation, that explanation. They're computations. And electrons are really points with attributes of mass and charge, and that's the only thing that works. It's kind of pretty solid proof that we're living in a virtual reality. Otherwise, it couldn't possibly be true. So that's the long story on subjective and objective. There were a lot of good questions. They spurred a lot of good answers that I think people will like.
I do. Thank you very much. Thank you for submitting the questions. As you can see, this is why we couldn't include it in the regular Fireside chat, but I'm kind of glad we didn't.
Yeah, it was just too long.
Through. Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you very much, Tom. I'm sure this will be appreciated, and there's some really interesting points in there.
Tom Campbell here. I and MBT Events hope you liked this video. We now have well over 1,000 hours of free video on this user-friendly, ad-free YouTube channel. Though these videos are free to our viewers, they represent many thousands of hours in production and editing, and many thousands of dollars invested in video and audio equipment, along with the required computers and software to store and process the raw video into finished products. So far, all of this content has been funded directly out of our own pockets. Be assured, we will always continue to do what we can. It's our life, our purpose, a labor of love that we will continue to pursue as best we can. However, those pockets are not as deep as they used to be. Thus, we are now seeking to augment our resources with support from our viewers. If you find something of significant value in our videos, please consider supporting their production through our Patreon account or through a one-time donation. The links are in the description below. Thank you.